Nobody in Moscow saw it coming. Not the analysts, not the generals, not the foreign intelligence officers who had spent months convincing themselves that Viktor Orbán was safe. On the morning of April 13th, 2026, the Kremlin woke up to a political earthquake that no missile could reverse and no intelligence operation had managed to prevent. And the shockwave from that earthquake is still moving through every institution, every funding mechanism, and every strategic calculation that Russia had built around its most valuable European asset. Péter Magyar had won, Viktor Orbán was finished, and Putin's single most effective tool inside the Western alliance had just been switched off by a ballot. Let's start with what Russia actually lost. Because the Western press focused on what Europe gained, and those are two different stories that need to be told together. Inside the European Union, every major decision on foreign policy requires unanimity. Every sanctions package, every financial commitment, every structural change to how the bloc relates to Russia or supports Ukraine. One government in a room of 27 can stop all of it. For 4 full years of the most destructive land war in Europe since World War II, Russia had that one government. It was Budapest. It was Orbán. And it worked with a precision that Russian military planners could only envy from the front line. Think about what that veto actually accomplished in practical terms across 4 years. Sanctions packages were delayed long enough for Russian oligarchs and financial institutions to reposition assets and restructure arrangements that the sanctions were designed to trap. Aid packages for Ukraine were blocked at critical moments, creating funding gaps that Kyiv scrambled to fill from other sources at higher cost and with less certainty. NATO decisions that required Hungarian participation were complicated or slowed. EU enlargement discussions that involved Ukraine were obstructed. Every time Europe's 27 governments reached near consensus on something that would genuinely damage Russia's position or genuinely help Ukraine's, there was Budapest, holding its hand up, demanding concessions, buying time, and sometimes simply saying no. None of that happened by accident. Orbán had been cultivating his relationship with Putin since long before the full-scale invasion. He was one of the only Western European leaders who visited Moscow after February 2022, not to warn, not to sanction, not to pressure, but to talk. He launched what he called a peace mission in the summer of 2024, flying to Kyiv and then Beijing, and then Moscow, without EU authorization, presenting himself as a mediator while his EU partners watched in a mixture of bewilderment and fury. He ran his April 2026 re-election campaign plastering images of Zelensky across Hungarian billboards with the message that only Orbán could keep Hungary out of the war, a framing that mirrored Kremlin talking points with a consistency that Ukrainian officials and their allies found impossible to describe as coincidental. And yet, for all of his institutional strength, the state media apparatus that amplified his message, the court system he had reshaped with loyalists over 16 years, the electoral rules his government had written to maximize Fidesz's advantage, Orbán walked into April 2026 losing. The Washington Post published reporting in March of that year revealing that Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, was internally alarmed. Polling was collapsing. The operatives proposed something they called the game changer, a staged assassination attempt on Orbán himself, designed to generate a sympathy wave that might rescue his numbers in the final weeks. A Russian spy agency plotting to fake the murder of a sitting European prime minister to win him an election. That is how desperate Moscow had become. It did not matter. Péter Magyar spent 2 years doing what no previous Hungarian opposition figure had managed, taking the fight out of Budapest and into the rural towns and smaller cities where Orbán's base had always been most solid. He talked not about geopolitics, but about hospital waiting rooms and teacher salaries and the yachts and mansions that appeared around Fidesz-connected elites, while ordinary Hungarian wages stagnated. He turned Orbán's own populist recipe against him. Us versus them. The people versus the powerful. The country's real interests against the interests of those who had captured the state. Except in Magyar's version, the corrupt elites were Fidesz, and the foreign power whose interests they served was not Brussels, but Moscow. On April 12, 2026, 80% of Hungary's eligible voters went to the polls. 80%. The highest democratic turnout in the country since communism fell in 1989. Magyar's TISA party won 138 of 199 parliamentary seats, a 2/3 constitutional supermajority achieved in a single election against an incumbent who had spent 16 years rewriting rules to make himself unbeatable. The margin was not a message, it was a verdict, and it hit the institutions of European foreign policy like a dam breaking. 11 days. That is how long it took from Orbán's defeat to the release of 90 billion euros for Ukraine's defense and the passage of Europe's 20th sanctions package against Russia. 11 days. 2 months of frozen negotiations, diplomatic impasse, and Ukrainian frustration resolved in a period shorter than a news cycle. What that timeline tells you is that the problem was never consensus. 26 of 27 EU governments were ready to move on both measures. The problem was one country, one leader, and one veto. Remove the veto and the machinery moves at a speed that surprises even Brussels insiders who had assumed the institution was incapable of rapid action. The structure of the €90 billion loan deserves careful attention because it is not just money. It is a statement about how Europe sees the war and who, it believes, should ultimately pay for it. For 2026, €45 billion flow to Ukraine. 28.3 billion specifically for military purposes, designated to go to European defense manufacturers with made in Europe provisions that pointedly exclude American producers. A message to Washington about European strategic autonomy at a moment when US-Europe relations over Ukraine have been under significant stress. Another 16.7 billion covers Ukraine's general budget needs, sustaining high government services for a population living under 4 years of continuous bombardment. The remaining 45 billion is committed for 2027, and the repayment clause is the most striking element of all. Ukraine returns the money only if Russia agrees to war reparations, something Moscow has categorically rejected. In practice, the loan is backed by the 210 billion euros in frozen Russian central bank assets sitting in European financial institutions. Russia's own money, seized as a consequence of its invasion, becomes the collateral for funding Ukraine's defense against that invasion. Orbán had held this loan hostage since February 2026, tying his veto to a dispute over the Druzhba pipeline, the Soviet-era infrastructure that carries Russian oil through Ukraine to Hungary and Slovakia. The pipeline had been interrupted after a Russian attack on Ukrainian infrastructure, and Orbán made restoring oil flows a precondition for releasing the loan. It was a brazen piece of leverage, used Russian oil as a bargaining chip to block European financial support for the country. Russia was bombing. Within days of Magyar's election victory, the dynamic shifted completely. Zelensky announced the pipeline had been repaired. Magyar said Hungary would not block the loan. Cyprus, holding the EU Council presidency, called an ambassadors' meeting. The impasse that had lasted 2 months dissolved in 48 hours. The same meeting that approved the loan also passed the 20th Russian sanctions package, the latest iteration of the financial and economic restrictions that Europe has been steadily tightening since 2022. European Council President Antonio Costa described both decisions as moving simultaneously in the two directions that define Europe's Ukraine strategy, strengthening Kiev's capacity to defend itself and increasing the economic cost to Moscow of continuing the war. The simultaneity mattered. For months, Orbán had blocked both tracks. The moment his veto disappeared, both tracks advanced together, signaling to Moscow that the structural constraint on European action that Budapest had represented was gone and would not be replaced. What does this mean for NATO? The picture is more complicated than the EU story, but it moves in the same direction. Orbán's Hungary had become a source of persistent friction inside the alliance, blocking or delaying cooperation initiatives, maintaining a public posture of studied neutrality that alliance partners found difficult to reconcile with the obligations of collective defense in the middle of a war on Europe's eastern flank. Magyar has committed explicitly to meeting NATO's defense spending targets, including the push toward 5% of GDP. He has pledged to restore what he calls constructive relationships with alliance partners. He will not, according to his campaign commitments, send weapons or troops to Ukraine or support Ukrainian NATO membership in the near term, but the baseline of obstruction that made Hungarian NATO participation an active management problem for alliance planners has ended. The question of Hungary's energy dependence on Russia is the one thread that will take longer to unravel than the political ones. 16 years of deliberate cultivation of Russian gas and oil relationships cannot be reversed by an election, regardless of the margin. Magyar has stated his intention to diversify Hungary's energy supply and wean the country off Russian hydrocarbons, and has asked the EU for financial support to facilitate that transition. The EU has strong reasons to provide it. Every percentage dependence on Russia weakens the economic argument that any future Hungarian government could use to justify maintaining close ties with Moscow. But the infrastructure for alternative supply routes does not exist at the scale Hungary needs, and building it takes years. Energy will remain a thread connecting Budapest to Moscow long after the political relationship has been severed. Russia's state television covered the Hungarian election results with the predictable deflection, claims of Western interference, accusations that Magyar was an installed puppet of Brussels and Washington, suggestions that the result did not reflect genuine Hungarian popular will. All of it was contradicted by the one data point that no amount of state media framing can erase: 80% turnout. You do not get 80% of eligible voters to the polls through foreign manipulation. You get it when an electorate has made a decision and wants the margin to be so large that it cannot be explained away. Hungary's voters made that decision. They did it with the highest participation rate in their democratic history. And the geopolitical consequences of their decision have already materialized in ways that Russia cannot reverse through any available instrument. For 4 years, the Kremlin had operated with the comfort of knowing that the European project was internally constrained, that however united the rhetoric of solidarity with Ukraine sounded from Brussels, the mechanics of unanimity meant that one friendly government in one member state could soften the edges of every consequential decision. That comfort is gone. The government has changed. The veto is lifted. The money is flowing. The sanctions are tightening. And the man who delivered all of this to Moscow is now a former prime minister, without a platform or a pathway back to power, watching from the political sidelines as the architecture he spent 16 years building for Russia's benefit dismantles itself, one institutional decision at a time. Putin's war has not ended on any front line as of this week. The drones are still flying over Ukrainian cities. The fighting in Donetsk continues. The ceasefire with the United States over Iran remains fragile, but something gigantic happened in Hungary on April 12th, and the 11 days that followed it have already changed the financial trajectory of the war, the unity of the Western alliance, and the strategic calculus that Russia has been running in Brussels for the better part of a decade. Wars are won and lost in many ways. Some battles happen on fields, some happen in parliamentary chambers, some happen in a polling booth at 80% turnout. Hungary just fought one of the most consequential battles of this war, and Russia lost it completely without firing a single shot in its own defense. The Russian intelligence community understood the value of this arrangement with a precision that its own military commanders would have envied. The SVR's internal alarm in March 2026, leaked through the Washington Post's reporting, revealed an organization that had modeled the consequences of an Orbán defeat with enough clarity to be genuinely frightened by the prospect. What that internal alarm also reveals, between the lines, is how much of Russia's European strategy was built around the assumption that Budapest would remain a reliable point of obstruction. The SVR operatives who proposed staging an assassination attempt were not acting from panic. They were acting from a cold assessment that without Orbán, a significant portion of Russia's non-military European strategy would become inoperable. They were correct in that assessment. They were unable to prevent the outcome. Magyar's path to power is also worth examining as a model because it carries lessons beyond Hungary that reverberate through European politics. He demonstrated that a determined, well-organized opposition can defeat an entrenched illiberal government even after that government has spent years capturing courts, media, and electoral mechanisms. If the opposition is disciplined enough to fight on the right terrain. Magyar did not fight on European values or liberal democratic theory. He fought on kitchen table economics. He asked Hungarians how much their grocery bills had risen. He asked them why the hospital in their town had closed 2 wards. He asked them to compare their salary to what a minister's family was spending on a yacht. He made the abstract, corruption, institutional capture, foreign alignment, into the concrete and personal. And he won 138 seats. That template, defeating illiberalism by making it economically personal rather than ideologically abstract, has implications for every other European country where Russia has cultivated political relationships with far-right or illiberal parties that have positioned themselves as voices of national sovereignty against a Brussels-centered establishment. Slovakia's Robert Fico, who has taken positions similar to Orbán's on Ukraine and Russia, is watching what happened to Orbán with an attention that his public statements do not reflect. So is every other European political figure who has built a relationship with Moscow on the assumption that popular frustration with establishment politics would protect them from electoral consequences. Magyar showed that the protection has limits. Push economic dissatisfaction far enough, and it overwhelms even well-constructed institutional advantages. For Ukraine, the implications of what happened in Hungary extend across multiple timeframes simultaneously. In the immediate term, the €90 billion loan changes the funding picture for 2026 and 2027 in ways that allow Ukrainian military planners to make longer-range decisions with greater confidence about resource availability. Zelensky confirmed that the first tranche is expected to arrive as early as May or June 2026, meaning that within weeks of Magyar's election victory, the most significant single European financial commitment to Ukraine's defense will begin flowing to Kyiv. In the medium term, the removal of Hungary as a structural blocker of EU unanimity decisions opens the path to further sanctions, tightening, further aid packages, and potentially further acceleration of Ukraine's EU membership process, all of which had been complicated by the knowledge that Budapest would resist or obstruct. In the longer term, a Hungary realigned with its EU and NATO partners, rather than positioned as Moscow's voice in Brussels, changes the internal dynamics of European foreign policy deliberation in ways that will accumulate over years. None of this means the war ends tomorrow. None of it means Ukraine is about to achieve a decisive military breakthrough that forces Russia to the negotiating table on terms Kyiv can accept. The battlefield in eastern Ukraine remains brutal, attritional, and deeply costly for both sides. Russia still has mass, more soldiers, more equipment and storage, more territory than it has been willing to trade away in any negotiation framework proposed so far. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran remains fragile. Trump's posture toward Budapest, the conflict continues to create uncertainty about the durability of American support. None of the hard strategic problems that Ukraine faces were solved in Budapest on April 12th. What was solved is this: the single most consequential structural constraint on Europe's ability to collectively support Ukraine, the Hungarian veto, wielded by a leader whose alignment with Moscow was both personal and strategic, has been removed. The machinery that was ready to move but couldn't because one government was blocking the door is now moving. 90 billion euros is flowing. The 20th sanctions package is law, the Druzhba pipeline is back in operation, and Péter Magyar, who 11 months ago was a political outsider with no government experience, is preparing to take office as Prime Minister of Hungary on May 9th, 2026, with a two-thirds parliamentary majority and a mandate from his people that Viktor Orbán, for all his institutional advantages, could not manufacture. Russia spent years investing in a geopolitical relationship inside the European Union that cost it nothing militarily and delivered results that no military campaign could have achieved. Delays, dilutions, vetoes, and obstruction at the highest level of Western institutional decision-making. Hungary just voted that investment out of existence. And the war that Russia thought it could outlast Europe on, the war it thought it could sustain because European unity would eventually fracture, just became significantly harder to sustain because the fracture point that Moscow had been pressing for 4 years has closed. The number that will define what happened in Hungary for history is not 138 seats, or 90 billion euros, or 80% turnout, though all not of those numbers are extraordinary. The number that matters most is 11. 11 days from Orbán's defeat to the release of the largest single European financial commitment to Ukraine's defense and the simultaneous passage of a new Russia sanctions package. 11 days to accomplish what 2 months of diplomacy, persuasion, and pressure could not achieve against the wall of a single government's veto. 11 days that demonstrate, with unmistakable clarity, that the problem inside the European Union was never the institution's willingness to act or its capacity to move resources at scale. The problem was Budapest. The problem was one man, one veto, and one strategic decision made years ago to align Hungary's foreign policy with the interests of a country that was systematically destroying a neighboring democracy. That problem is over now. The man is gone. The veto is lifted. The money is moving. And somewhere in Moscow, in the institutions and offices where Russia's European strategy was planned and managed, analysts are running models of what happens next without the instrument they relied on, and finding that the scenarios they are modeling are all worse than the ones they were running before April 12th. Hungary happened. It was gigantic. And for Putin's war, the consequences have only just begun to unfold. The strategic loss that Russia has suffered in Budapest is not the kind that shows up in satellite imagery or in frontline maps. It does not look like a destroyed refinery or a sunken warship or a degraded air defense network. It looks like a spreadsheet entry changing from blocked to approved on a 90 billion euro financial instrument. It looks like an ambassador raising no objection in a room in Brussels. It looks like a pipeline resuming operations after a 3-month interruption. These are the quiet mechanisms of a war being fought simultaneously on fields and in institutions, and in the institutional dimension. Hungary just handed Ukraine and its European partners a victory that will fund the battlefield dimension for the next 2 years. Putin built his European strategy around the assumption that democracy inside the EU would eventually become its own enemy, that the internal contradictions of a 27-member bloc requiring unanimity would generate enough friction, enough vetoes, enough obstruction from enough directions that Western solidarity would soften and fracture over time. That assumption was not unreasonable, given the EU's institutional design. It was tested in Hungary, where Russia had invested most heavily in cultivating exactly the kind of leader who could make that assumption operational. And it failed, not because the EU reformed its institutions or changed its rules, but because Hungarian voters went to the polls at 80% turnout and chose a different future, democracy, defeated Russia's strategy for exploiting democracy. That is the gigantic thing that happened in Hungary, and its implications will outlast this war.